screen? Yeah, thank you so much to everyone for being here. Thank you to the organizers for a great conference so far. This is a slightly updated version of the handout that's on the website. So I have a tiny URL up here, tinyurl.com/Drummond-AFLA. If you want this copy, it's also on my website. But today I'll get started. Let me just turn on the timer so I know where I am. So I'll be talking about sluicing today. And sluicing, just as a baseline, refers to clausal ellipsis that strands a WH phrase. So we can see an example in English from one, Johnny dropped something, but I don't know what. And I'll be following some standard sluicing terminology throughout the talk, where this first clause is the antecedent, which determines the interpretation of the elided constituent. Then we have the sluice, which is the portion that's elided, and I'll be writing that in angle brackets throughout. And then the remnant is the material that's moving outside of the ellipsis site, so the WH phrase. So recent work has argued pretty convincingly that sluicing is constrained by at least some syntactic identity condition. So we at least need something like 2, where the heads in the verbal spine of the elided constituent must be syntactically identical to the corresponding heads in the antecedent. But as we look beyond European languages at sluicing, there have been 2 potential challenges that have arisen. The first is pseudocleft sluicing. So Potsdam shows that in Malagasy, WH questions are pseudoclefts, and these may undergo sluicing with a non-pseudocleft antecedent. So those 2 things are kind of inherently non-identical in the syntax. And the second challenge is voice mismatches. So unlike in English, there are some voice mismatches under sluicing that are grammatical, and specifically those that are enforced by an extraction restriction. So Rodrigo Renero has written recently about these in Kakchikel, Sandy Chung on Chamorro, Malagasy as well. So these are widespread. So today I'm going to be using sluicing data from Nukuoro, which is a Polynesian outlier language of Micronesia. And I'm going to be showing that these 2 challenges can be accounted for while maintaining a syntactic identity condition. So first, I'm going to show that pseudocleft sluicing in Nukuoro involves ellipsis of a smaller IP, so the relative IP, rather than the matrix IP. And secondly, I'll be showing that apparent voice mismatches due to an ergative extraction restriction can be analyzed as voice matches plus repair under ellipsis, which has been identified for islands and NAT trace effects as well. So from this second conclusion, we might be able to get some insight into the nature of extraction restrictions, specifically that they could be analyzed like islands or that trace effects, kind of unify them. We could analyze them as PF violations or as a type of WH agreement. Okay, so I'll start with some background on Nukuoro. It's an SVO Polynesian outlier language spoken by about 1,200 people, primarily in Micronesia and in the US as well. And all of the data presented in this talk comes from my own fieldwork in Pohnpei on Nukuoro Atoll and most recently over Zoom. So here we have some maps to set yourself in the geography. So Micronesia is just north of Papua New Guinea. This star here represents Pohnpei, which is the state capital, and then Nukuoro is an outlying island in Pohnpei state. So linguistically, Nukuoro is an outlier. It has basic SVO word order as shown in 3. Unlike many Polynesian languages, core arguments are not marked for case, so we don't get ergative case marking, and there's also no verbal agreement with subjects or objects. Nukuoro uses a genitive relative clause, where subjects of relative clauses appear in genitive case. And this is either marked by a genitive pronoun or by the particle a or o before proper and common nouns. So these are some relative clauses in 4. And notice that these don't use a complementizer, which suggests that these are smaller than CP, so something like an IP or a TP. Nukuoro also shows an ergative extraction restriction under relativization. So intransitive subjects and transitive objects can be relativized using an unmarked gap, which we see in 5a. But if we relativize a transitive subject, the verb must appear in what I will call passive voice, which involves an idiosyncratic verbal suffix CIA plus the optional particle ina. And I'm happy to talk more about ina in the question period. I know this is not an uncontroversial claim to say that this is a passive. But this morphology is used in a productive passive construction in Nuku'oro, kind of like the Eastern Polynesian languages, which promotes the patient to preverbal subject position and demotes the agent to an optional oblique marked by the preposition E. And finally, as in many Polynesian languages, Nuku'oro WH questions are pseudoclefts, which consist of a predicate WH phrase that takes a headless relative clause as its subject. So we have some examples like in 7, and I say that the predicate WH phrase fronts to the specifier of some high functional head, which I call F, and I have some evidence for this structure in Appendix A if you're curious. And embedded WH questions use the same pseudocleft structure just under the complementizer be. Okay, and lastly, the relative head in a pseudocleft is typically null, but it can also be overt, which is going to be relevant in the next section. So common dummy heads that appear in this position include demonstratives like tera, that one, and nouns like thing or person can go in this position as well, which we see in 10. Okay, so let's turn to the first puzzle. So sluicing in languages with pseudocleft WH questions kind of presents an inherent challenge to syntactic identity. One is a pseudocleft, one is not. How can those be syntactically identical? So for instance, Malagasy allows sluicing of pseudocleft WH questions, which the sluices leave behind only the embedded WH word, which we see here in 12. Bao painted something, but I forget what. So Potsdam 2007 assumes that Malagasy sluicing involves ellipsis of the clausal IP, which then contains the subject relative clause DP in its specifier. You can see that here in 14. So this elided constituent here is clearly not the same as its matrix antecedent. So instead, Potsdam concludes that we need a semantic identity condition on sluicing. And what I'm going to argue instead is that pseudocleft sluicing simply targets a smaller IP, the relative clause IP, which has a typical clause structure and can be syntactically identical to the antecedent. So like Malagasy, Nuku'oro has a sluicing construction despite having pseudocleft WH questions. So we see that in 15, Johnny saw someone, but I don't know who, where we then allied the rest. So since pseudoclefts are biclausal, there are two possibilities for clausal ellipsis. Matrix IP, which we saw before, but we could also elide this smaller IP down here, which is contained within the subject. And relative clause ellipsis has been claimed to not exist, but it has been identified in a number of other languages as well, including Hungarian, Brazilian Portuguese, and Gongbe. So this is a viable possibility. But notice that when the relative head is null, we really don't have a way of deciding between these two. There's nothing morphological that will tell us which one it is. But in Nuku'oro, if the relative head is overt, we see that it can remain outside of the sluice. So we can sluice like in 18, where we have that overt demonstrative. I don't know who is that one there. So if the relative head can stay outside of the sluice, that favors the analysis in 17, right, where we have that overt head here in D. So if ellipsis only targets this lower IP, the sluice has a typical clause structure rather than a pseudocleft and can be syntactically identical to the antecedent. And we see this here in 21 and 22. So this is our antecedent structure. And if we elide that lower IP, we have syntactic identity modulo this variable, which is typical of sluicing. So a quick side note about pseudo-sluicing. So sluices like 18 do pass diagnostics for sluicing. It does look like there's clausal ellipsis there, and they fail diagnostics for cleft-based sources or copular sources like pseudo-sluicing or spading. And I have more evidence for that in Appendix B. But for instance, these sluices can undergo sprouting, so they can have an adjunct remnant, and they can also be modified by else, which are both claimed to be impossible for pseudo-sluices. So you can say Johnny hid the money, but I don't know where with that demonstrative. And you can also say Johnny sent Mina to the store, but I don't know who else with the demonstrative as well. Okay, so that's Nuku'oro. I want to return to Malagasy, which will be somewhat speculative, but Potsdam notes that there is a demonstrative that can survive in Malagasy in a sluicing-like construction, although it's not clear whether this construction should be analyzed as sluicing or pseudo-sluicing. So we have things like 23, where we have a demonstrative following the WH word. So if these constructions pass diagnostics for sluicing, then maybe the relative clause ellipsis analysis that I present could extend to Malagasy as well. And I do want to note one more prediction of the relative IP analysis, which is that material in the left periphery of the relative clause might survive sluicing, so things in the C domain. And this is true in Hungarian, where relativizers stay overt. But in Malagasy, relativizers and interrogative C heads like no cannot survive sluicing. So there's a question there, right? Why wouldn't these survive if we're just eliding an IP in the relative clause? Fortunately, I don't think this is fatal for the present analysis. So we know cross-linguistically that C heads dominating sluices are often unexpectedly empty. So what we might want to do is attribute the lack of overt C to phonological conditions on sluicing, and this is what liptac does for Hungarian. So we know that remnants escaping clausal ellipsis typically must be able to bear stress. And Hungarian relativizers independently can bear stress, which allows them to survive sluicing in liptac's argument. But it's possible that these Malagasy C heads may not, and that may await some further research. So just to summarize this section, Pseudoclefts sluices in Nukuoro appear to elide a relative IP, which ensures that the sluice is syntactically identical to the antecedent. These things do look like true sluices, not pseudo-sluices. And this relative analysis may also be available for Malagasy, but we will see. Okay, so let's turn to the second puzzle, which is voice mismatches. So these are typically ruled out under a syntactic identity condition on sluicing, which is great for languages like English, where we can't get passive-active mismatches or vice versa. So we can't say Joe was murdered, but we don't know who, where we would have passive in the antecedent, but active in the sluice. And we can't do the other way around either. However, several languages do appear to allow voice mismatches, specifically those that use voice to obviate an extraction restriction. So in Kakchikel, for instance, Renero has written about this pretty recently. Ergative subjects may only be extracted if the verb uses agent-focused voice, which we see in 27a. So if the WH remnant of a sluice is an ergative subject, the implied voice contained within the sluice is agent focus. And this can freely mismatch with active voice in the antecedent. So I'm going to argue that voice mismatches of a similar type in Nukuoro are actually voice matches, and then ergative extraction gets repaired under ellipsis, similarly to islands and that trace effects. True voice mismatches are always ruled out by syntactic identity under this analysis. So the Nukuoro data, as in Kakchikel, we can use the extraction restriction to infer what verb is contained within the sluice. So recall that if the WH remnant is a transitive subject, the voice in the sluice must be passive. It must have ina. And I'm going to refer to these passives as ergative extraction passives, which differentiates them from quote unquote true passives. So what we find is that an active antecedent can grammatically co-occur with an ergative extraction passive in the sluice. So we can say things like somebody hit me, but I don't know who. Where we have ina in the sluice, but an active form in the antecedent. We can also have a passive antecedent matching with an ergative extraction passive. And this is somewhat surprising from the point of view of English, because you can say the equivalent of something was stolen, but I don't know who. That's not good in English, but in Nukuoro, it's good. And here we have an ina form in the antecedent, but we also have an ina form in the sluice, right? Forced by ergative extraction. And that's fine. There are some things that cannot mismatch. So for instance, valence altering morphology like causatives, statives can't mismatch. We can't say things like the stone rolled, but I don't know who, where we have this haka causative in the sluice. And we also can't mismatch a stative. So the cups broke, but I don't know who broke them. We can't mismatch that as well. So here's a summary of what is allowed. Basically, ergative extraction passives are grammatical with active and passive antecedents, and other things are ungrammatical to mismatch. And this is very similar to what Monero found for Kakchikel. So in Kakchikel, agent focus can freely co-occur with active and passive voices, but other voice mismatches like anti-passive active are ungrammatical. So the cross-linguistic generalization is that the voice that's forced by extraction restrictions can freely mismatch, and other verbal structure cannot. Okay, so what I'm going to argue here is that ergative extraction can be repaired by ellipsis, and that voice mismatches are only apparent. So it's well known that ellipsis repairs certain types of syntactic violations. So I have an island repair here. Do you know who Dakota will be mad if Omri talks to is a classic adjunct island. But if we place the same thing in a sluice, Dakota will be mad if Omri talks to someone. Do you know who? And that becomes fine. And the same is true of that trace effects. So we see that sluicing also repairs islands in Nukuoro, which I show here for an adjunct clause island. This is basically the same as 33. And a prominent view holds that islands are PF violations of some sort, which allows them to be repaired by non-pronunciation. There are some who argue that ellipsis doesn't actually repair islands at all. I talk about that a little bit in Appendix D. But for simplicity here, I'll represent island violations with a star. And ungrammaticality arises if that diacritic survives the derivation, if it's pronounced, but if it's deleted by ellipsis, it no longer causes a crash. So that schema is here in 36. Here it survives and we get ungrammaticality. Here it's contained within the sluice and it's grammatical. So if we apply this to Nukuoro voice mismatches, like in 28, we can assume that illicit A-bar movement creates the same diacritic that island violating movement does. So what we would say is that the extraction of an ergative from an active clause would incur a violation, notated by star. But if this were contained within a sluice, it would be deleted and the derivation rescued. So what we can say then is that this sluice in 28 actually contains active voice in the sluice. Extraction of this ergative WH phrase would generate some kind of movement violation, but then it's deleted by sluicing. So this ends up being grammatical. But here under this analysis, there is no actual voice mismatch. Both clauses in 28 prime are an active voice and syntactic identity is satisfied. On the other hand, we had some ergative extraction passives co-occurring with true passives. So I want to note here that there are effectively two derivations when we have an ergative WH question in a sluice. One is the active voice in a star violation, which we saw up here. But we could also have passive voice. We could have Ina and have no violation at all. And I propose that that's what's going on here in 29, right? We have a passive in the antecedent and we have a passive in the sluice. That is grammatical movement, gets sluiced, no problem. And finally, this island repair analysis explains why other argument structure mismatches are ruled out. So since these alternations don't involve some kind of illicit movement, they can't be repaired under ellipsis. And they're just ruled out a priori by syntactic identity. Okay, so to summarize, repair by ellipsis explains why the voice forced by extraction restrictions is special in some way. It doesn't count for syntactic identity, while other mismatches do. And the reason here is that illicit movement can be repaired by non-pronunciation, but other syntactic mismatches just cannot. Okay, so to wrap up, I've talked about Nukuoro sluicing, which contributes an additional example of sluicing in a language that has non-canonical WH movement and an extraction restriction. And I've argued that we can maintain a syntactic identity condition for both of these major challenges. So pseudocleft sluices can elide a smaller non-pseudocleft constituent, namely a relative IP, and mismatches due to ergative extraction can be analyzed as repair under ellipsis. And from the second point, if that's true, we can then generalize, and sluicing data can provide a new kind of evidence for analyses of extraction restrictions. So for one, maybe we want to unify analyses of extraction restrictions with a treatment of islands or that trace effects. Maybe they're just the same thing, the same type of violation. Or we might say that ergative extraction restrictions are also PF phenomena, if that's what allows islands to be repaired by ellipsis. And third, this analysis is also compatible with the view of extraction restrictions as WH agreement, which is a very common analysis of Philippine type voice systems, since agreement can mismatch more broadly under ellipsis. But crucially, some analyses are incompatible with a repair under ellipsis analysis. So I'll just mention one. Polinsky 2016 argues that some languages that have ergative extraction restrictions have prepositional ergatives and then disallow both p stranding and pied piping. However, sluicing famously does not repair p stranding or pied piping violations, as we see in 38 for Greek. And this suggests that sluicing also would not repair ergative extraction restrictions if that was the source of the ungrammaticality. So further documentation of sluicing in languages that have extraction restrictions is really necessary to solidify the generalization itself, identify any areas of cross-linguistic variation, and find other ways to test the island repair hypothesis. And that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Emily. So if you have questions, use the raise hand function or just write them down in the chat box and I will read them out. Okay, Dan has a hand. Go ahead, Dan.
Hi, Emily. Thanks for the really, really great talk. I have a question about the status of pseudo-sluicing or like a clefting origin for these constructions. So we know that in Indonesian and many languages of Western and Central Indonesia, apparent sluices do permit p stranding. You know, Katie Fortin's work. And we know that in a lot of these languages, apparent clefts are compatible with things like the else test. And so it seems like, well, so I wonder what you think about the, in light of that fact about else in particular, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about ruling out a copular, like a copular clause underlying structure for some of these sluices in Nukworo.
Yeah, that's a great question. So first I will say that Nukworo doesn't really seem to have a copular construction as we know it. So typically, if you want something like a copular construction, the noun, like if you want to have a noun nominal predicate or something like that, you have to get the determiner se, which is like a predicative indefinite, something like that. So it doesn't necessarily, it's not for granted that there's kind of like a null copula or something like that. But what I'll also say, so Nukworo, these sluices pass these two tests, sprouting and else modification, but they also fail this third one, which is TP adjuncts, which are supposed to be good for pseudo sluices and bad for sluicing. And these are bad in Nukworo. So you can't add some kind of a TP level adjunct like yesterday. I've tried a bunch of adjuncts here and they don't really seem to work. So that's what I would say to that. The else test, yeah, it seems like each one of these tests on its own might not be entirely convincing, but it's kind of the full picture that helps here. Yeah, thank you for that.
Anyone else? We still have 5 minutes left. Okay, Harrison?
I guess I have kind of a speculative / wild question. I'm wondering what you think. So given what you say about kind of so voice that's required for the extraction restriction versus other kinds of valency changing operations. So you kind of, so my understanding is that you're treating them as these kinds of things as a unified class, but then because of how they differ in how they interact with extraction, that's where I get the differences in sluicing. I'm wondering what you think about the idea that these two things might just be sort of entirely different kinds of like I guess you could say operations or processes.
Mm-hmm. So you're referring to like the causative stative stuff.
Yeah.
active passive stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do think so. I think you're totally right that these are kind of completely different things, right? So causatives and statives like introduce, or like especially the causative introduces an argument. Whereas the active and passive, it's a little more like switching things around. So the reason why I focused on these is because there are no other voice categories that I can test in Nukuoro, so I can't show, for instance, like a true active and a true passive between the antecedent and the sluice, one that's not concerned with ergative extraction. So Rodrigo Renero and Cacciakel uses these anti-passive active mismatches. Those are ungrammatical. I don't have anything like that. So this was just kind of a baseline test of like, is it anything goes, right? Is it just fully permissive across the board? So I think these are probably worse categorically than the voice mismatch ones. I think they're definitely different, but that was kind of my baseline for Nukuoro. And then this generalization here is really a compilation, a typological generalization from what we know about Nukuoro and Cacciakel and Chamorro and a few other languages as well. It really looks like something to do with extraction restrictions. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, then okay, Dan again, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Sorry for pelting you with questions. This is so interesting.
Right.
So I wonder if there's some kind of like VP ellipsis in Nukuoro and whether or not you see the same like mismatches there, because you do actually in Mandar.
So I've looked a little bit at VP ellipsis. Unfortunately, Nukuoro doesn't have VP ellipsis, or it has something that looks like verb stranding VP ellipsis. So there's no way to elide the verb and an object. All you can get is elision of the object, which I haven't really tested yet whether that's just object drop, which is also possible, or if that's true VP ellipsis where you're then like moving a VP remnant, or I don't know. So yeah, so it's unclear whether VP ellipsis is possible.
Okay, we can probably have a short question, one more. Eileen, Liana, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, that's great talk. Thanks, Emily. It was really clear and convincing. So I'm just asking a question just for the sake of asking a question. No, but I'm kind of curious about what you're actually proposing, the idea that it's the IP within the relative clause that gets elided, and which I think is very clever. I don't know, like I'm just sort of thinking, like, if you could speculate about this kind of source for a sluice, and like you mentioned Hungarian, but do you have any thoughts about why it's possible here and maybe we don't see it in other languages?
Yeah, so I think I'll start with, I have two kind of different answers to that. One is that LibTech has, which was a recommendation from Eric Potsdam, so thank you for that reference. But this Hungarian data, she speculates that it's really whether or not you can have like stressed material above this IP that tells you whether or not you even permit this. So she's like, you know, Romance languages, you can't stress the relativizer, therefore you can't do relative ellipsis. So that's one possibility, is that Nukuoro just doesn't have a lot here. It doesn't have complementizers, it doesn't have relativizers, and that makes it very free, but obviously in Malagasy that's not true. But what was the other thing that this made me think of is, I believe it is possible to sluice when you actually do have a pseudocleft in the antecedent. So if you said, it's Johnny who saw someone, but I don't know who. I believe that might be possible in Nuguoro, and I have a few data examples like that, which makes it look like you could elide this lower one, or you could elide this bigger one. So it could be a kind of last resort type thing where like, it's just looking for an identical antecedent, and if it can find one, great, put it in. So that's kind of how I've been thinking about this. Like, it seems to be optional. It seems to be kind of conditioned by what's available. Yeah, thank you.